This is a PowerPoint presentation of the second part of the central nervous system that extends from the brain down the vertebral canal, and this is the spinal cord. Collecting lots of information and locking it up in the memory room of the brain is really hard work and boring. It is very important that when we pile up information, we make use of it and makes it give us good marks. What is this little girl doing? The more important question is, what is going in her mind? The answer is simple. She is integrating pieces of jigsaw puzzle. If we are blessed with the ability to integrate things, even when we are kids, why don't we develop this skill and use it in our science? The name of the game in science is to integrate pieces of information. Integration of scientific information is a kind of fun and makes our lives much easier and makes us more successful. What do we have here? This is a view of the base of the brain. What is this blue marked structure? It is the medulla oblongata. What is medulla oblongata? It is the lowest part of the brain stem, inferior to the pons. What is it going to do? It is going to continue as the spinal cord. Where is the spinal cord? It's at the beginning of foramen magnum. What is foramen magnum? This is something you already know. It is the largest foramen in the skull, and it is in the posterior cranial fossa, part of the occipital bone. What are the main features of the spinal cord? At least, what does it look like? Is it a complete circuit, or does it have any feature? It has features. Some of them are external and some of them are internal. These features are specific for spinal cord. Now, if we look at the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, we see a median sulcus, and then an elevation, and then lateral to the elevation we have the posterior intermediate sulcus, and if we have a median sulcus and intermediate sulcus, then we have a lateral sulcus. All these features are on the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. Then on the anterior part of the spinal cord, we have also three depressions. The one in the middle is the median fissure, and we have two anterior lateral sulci. These are the external features of the spinal cord. Now we know that the spinal cord in an adult person starts at the level of foramen magnum. Now, where does it end in an adult person? The answer is it ends at the level of the disc between lumbar 1 and lumbar 2. So that is a description of its end. Question: is the spinal cord uniformly shaped along all its way? The answer is no, it is not. It has two dilatations, meaning that the spinal cord gets wider in two areas, and these two enlargements are the first one is present in the neck, and it is called the cervical enlargement from C4 to T2, and the second one is the lumbar enlargement from L2 to S3. Why do we have these enlargements? It's because these areas corresponds to the upper limb in case of the cervical enlargement, and the lower limb in case of the lumbar enlargement. Now, upper limb and lower limb, they have many muscles, and these muscles, they need nerve supply, and therefore the spinal cord in these areas is going to have more nervous tissue. If the spinal cord is located in the spinal canal and it is a bit narrower than the spinal canal, then when we move, does the spinal cord move as well? The answer is no, it doesn't, because it is fixed in position to the vertebral column. What fixes the spinal cord to the vertebral column? The answer is the pia mater. The pia mater, which is the innermost layer of the meninges, it covers the brain and continues down to cover the spinal cord. But in case of the spinal cord, it is going to send ligaments, which are called the denticulate ligament, which are going to fix the spinal cord transversely into the vertebral column, so that the spinal cord does not move right and left. Do we have positional changes of the spinal cord? The answer is yes. We have noticed that the spinal cord ends at the level of upper part of lumbar 2 or lower of lumbar 1. To be more exact, it is at the level of the intervertebral disc between L1 and L2. Now, it still gives nerves lower down, the L3, 4, 5, and then the sacral and the coccyx. So we have positional changes in the cord. In the very early development of the embryo, up to the 3rd month, the spinal cord expands throughout the entire length of the vertebral canal. So each spinal nerve comes out through corresponding intervertebral foramen, and the spinal nerves pass through the same level of the segment and the intervertebral foramen. But something is going to happen. The vertebral column, the skeleton, the vertebrae, they grow much faster than the spinal cord. Spinal cord cannot follow the growth of the vertebral column. Therefore, The terminal end of the spinal cord gradually shifts higher up, but the vertebral column continues growing down, and in the adult we get this position. In very young children, it is not at the level of L1, L2. It is lower down, and that is important when we want to take a sample of the CSF fluid. Let us clarify this situation. In this image, we can see that the spinal nerve, it comes almost horizontal, coming from the spinal cord going towards the intervertebral foramen. Later, when the vertebral column grows more rapid than the spinal cord, then we have this situation. The spinal nerve comes out of the spinal cord higher up, goes down till it meets its allocated intervertebral foramen to go out of it. So this is the level of origin of the spinal nerve, and this is the level of point of exit of that specific spinal nerve. The spinal cord is a continuation of medulla oblongata. That's the beginning point. What about the end point? The end point is what is called conus medullaris. It is a cone-shaped end of spinal cord, and this is between the level of L1 and L2. These were the external features of the spinal cord. What about the internal ones? When we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we can see that in an opposite way to the cerebral hemispheres, we have the white matter on the outside and the gray matter on the inside. That is the opposite arrangement of the layers of the brain. Then we have an outer white matter and an inner gray matter. In this section of the spinal cord, we can see that the gray matter makes the inside of the spinal cord, and it is arranged in an edge-shaped structure. Posteriorly, we have what is called the posterior horn, which is sensory, and an anterior horn, which is motor, and then we have a connecting gray matter between the right and the left parts of the gray matter. This is called the intermediate mass of the gray matter, and inside this intermediate mass we have the central canal. What is the central canal? It is a continuation of the fourth ventricle of the brain. What does it contain? It contains cerebrospinal fluid. When we go to the white matter, which is on the outside, it is divided into three parts. The posterior one of a half of the spinal cord is called the posterior funiculus, which is a white matter and contains axons going up and down in tracts. And then we have the lateral funiculus, and we have the anterior funiculus. The question raised in this idea is the cross-section of the spinal cord the same all the way from foramen magnum down to the conus medullaris? The answer is no. It is going to be a little bit of different shape than the other areas, and we are not going to go into details of this idea. Now, this is the idea of a section of the spinal cord that has a lateral horn. This lateral horn is part of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, when we studied the mind map, the functional classification of the nervous system, we know that there is sensory, motor, and autonomic. The question now is this lateral horn present all along the spinal cord? The answer is no. It is present in all thoracic segments of the spinal cord, plus L1 and maybe L2. So this is part of the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. Here is the very beginning of the early story of spinal nerves. Now, different types of sensations from the body, they come through the spinal nerve. And this spinal nerve is going to belong to the cell body on the dorsal part of the spinal nerve called dorsal root ganglia. Any sensation before it gets into the central nervous system must have its cell body outside the central nervous system. This cell body or this neuron is pseudo-unipolar neuron. Then it receives an axon from the peripheral part of the body and then sends an axon to the central nervous system through the dorsal root, and it gets into the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and it crosses to the other side of the spinal cord and then goes up to end in the thalamus, the most important relay station of sensations. Now, the story of the motor part. You can see this arrow is horizontal because there is a crossing higher up in the pyramid structure of medulla oblongata, and fibers will come through the white matter of the spinal cord, and it ends in the anterior horn of the gray matter, and then there is a neuron here which is going to send an axon into the ventral root of the spinal cord, the spinal nerve, and it is going towards its targets. Here's the story of the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. related to the lateral horn of the spinal cord. The upper motor neuron, the axon is going to end up in the lateral horn, and then through the ventral root the axons will go and reach the spinal nerve, and they leave the spinal nerve to synapse in a ganglia of the sympathetic trunk, and the ganglion is going to send its axon to travel through the spinal nerve to reach internal organs. Don't forget, autonomic nervous system regulates the internal organs. We will have another look at the arrangement of the spinal nerve, the first part of the peripheral nervous system coming from spinal cord. To start with, this is the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve is a short structure. Where do I find the spinal nerve? I will find it in the intervertebral foramen, which we are going to see in a few slides later. This spinal nerve is made of anterior ramus. The anterior ramus is a large ramus that goes along the posterior abdominal wall or the posterior body wall, and lateral and anterior. This is a large part of the spinal nerve, which is the anterior ramus. The second component is the posterior ramus. The posterior ramus is shorter and it goes to the back of the body, supplying muscles of the back and skin of the back. We do not have many muscles at the back, and not as many as muscles in the upper limb and lower limb and chest wall and the abdominal wall. The other branch is the meningeal branch, which goes out of the spinal nerve and gets again back to the vertebral canal to supply the meninges of the spinal cord. Now, this story on the dorsal part or the posterior part will be completed by the posterior root ganglion. This is a pseudo-unipolar ganglia containing these neurons, and these neurons have two axons. One axon coming from the peripheral part of the body, and the other axon is going to make the posterior rootlets of the spinal nerve, and these are going to enter the posterior horn. Then we have the motor anterior part, usually starts as rootlets, the same way the dorsal part ends as rootlets entering the spinal cord. Here it starts as rootlets and then as a root and joins the spinal nerve to go to the skeletal muscles and other effector organs. This is a three-dimensional model of the spinal cord and the dorsal and ventral roots of the spinal nerve. This is the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and this is the ventral horn, and this is a lateral horn concerned with sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. It is always useful to test yourself and test your knowledge. Here is the three-dimensional model of the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and test yourself what are the structures marked by these question marks. We have already asked ourselves where is the spinal nerve and the dorsal root ganglion, and the answer was it is in the intervertebral foramen. So let's see the intervertebral foramen, which is made by a notch in the superior pedicle of the vertebra above, and a notch on the superior surface of the vertebra below, plus the intervertebral disc between these two vertebrae, and this is the intervertebral foramen. And what do we see in this foramen? We see the short spinal nerve. The intervertebral foramen is a confined space made by bones and intervertebral disc, and it has the spinal nerve inside it. So the space is very confined, and if there is a protrusion of the intervertebral disc, then there is pressure on the spinal nerve, and the person is going to feel severe pain and numbness and problems along the distribution of that spinal nerve. Now, with old age, especially if the person is heavyweight, then the vertebrae will develop extensions pointed at the tips of the black arrows. These are called osteophytes, and if an osteophyte grows into the intervertebral foramen, then it is going to exert pressure on the spinal nerve, leading to pain. Then there is the issue of tracts. What are tracts? Tracts are axons going up and down the spinal cord in the white matter. The ones going up are sensory, and the ones coming down are motor. They end up or begin in the gray matter, and then they go to the white matter and go up or down. Now, this is a model of an ascending tract of pain and temperature. The signal starts at receptors in the skin or elsewhere, and the spinal nerve will come to connect to its mother cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and this dorsal root ganglion contains neurons that are pseudo-unipolar, and sends an axon to enter the dorsal horn, and then it synapses with a second neuron. This second neuron is going to cross to the other side of the spinal cord, and then goes up in the anterior nucleus, and then this is the second order neuron, which will end up in the thalamus. And the thalamus, the final destination of all sensations, will send the third order neuron into the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. Again, this is another example of when you are pricked by a pin, you feel sensations, and these sensations are carried by axons of nerves, and the cell body of these axons is in the dorsal root ganglia, which sends another axon going to the dorsal horn synapses with a neuron in the gray horn, and the axon is going to cross to the other side, and then it travels through the spinal cord, medulla oblongata, and reaches the thalamus and then to the sensory cortex. The other example we are looking at is the motor, the descending tracts. This is one of the descending tracts. The story starts at the pre-central gyrus, where area 4, where we decide to make special movement. Then from the cortex, the fibers will collect and pass through the internal capsule, going down to the midbrain and then to the bones and then to the medulla, and the lower part of the medulla, where a structure is seen called the pyramid. These axons are going to cross to the other side, and when they cross, they descend into the spinal cord, end up in the anterior horn, the motor part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and this is the neuron here, which is going to send an axon to reach the target organ through the spinal nerve. Peripheral nerves, and they are the spinal nerves coming out from the spinal cord. They are made of axons, no dendrites, and they're arranged in a way just like the muscle. Here we have an axon. It has a myelin sheath. Although the majority of axons in a peripheral nerve are myelinated, there are some unmyelinated axons, and this axon has a connective tissue sheath called endoneurium, and axons are arranged in bundles called fascicles, and each fascicle is covered by the perineurium, and the whole nerve is wrapped up by the epineurium. What is the next stage of the peripheral spinal nerves? The beginning of the story starts with the spinal nerve, which has a dorsal ramus, which is going to the back, and the target organs of the dorsal rami are few. The ventral ramus is going to turn around the body wall, and the target organs are many. Therefore, the ventral ramus is much larger than the dorsal ramus. Now, these ventral rami, when they face the job of innervating lots of muscles, and when these muscles are responsible for fine and skillful movements, these ventral rami will rearrange themselves. This process of rearranging themselves to reach the target muscles they form a plexus. What is a plexus? A plexus is a network, and this is an example here of cervical plexus made of C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. You can see that the yellow part is where things shuffle, and this shuffling process is in the form of loops, and after the plexus is going to give the end result, which are the final branches going to muscles. The cervical plexus gives superficial branches to the skin and structures of the neck, and deep branches which are going to supply the muscles of the neck, plus a very special nerve which is called the phrenic nerve, the nerve supply of the diaphragm, sensory and motor. Now, why is the target, the diaphragm, is so much away from the cervical plexus? It is because the diaphragm developed first in the neck and received its nerve supply. But with the differential growth of different parts of the body, the diaphragm went down, but the root of the phrenic nerve stayed in its place. This is a diagram of the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is made of ventral rami. There is no dorsal ramus that shares in the formation of a plexus, or plexuses are made by ventral rami of spinal nerves. The brachial plexus is made of roots C4, C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. They shuffle and they form different stages of shuffling and reshuffling. We are not going to go into details of this. This is called the brachial plexus. The end result of the brachial plexus is the formation of nerves going to supply different muscles of the upper limb. The lumbar plexus, where you can see the roots of the plexus, they are all ventral rami, and they shuffle and they end up giving the final branches to muscles of the pelvis and upper limb. This is the story of the sacral plexus, and there's a connection between the lumbar and the sacral plexus, which is the L4, and then we have L5, S1, S2, S3, and S4, and the ventral rami making this plexus will shuffle and give end results of the main nerves of the lower limb. This is a diagram of the three major nerves, final branches of the brachial plexus, which are going to supply nerves of the upper limb. The median nerve is the nerve of flexion of the wrist and the hand, and they supply muscles of the anterior compartment of the forearm and many muscles in the hand. The ulnar nerve, which is passing behind or posterior to the medial epicondyle of the humerus, is also going to to supply one muscle in the forearm and several muscles in the hand. The lower nerve, the radial nerve, the radial nerve is the nerve of extension. Therefore, it is going to supply the posterior compartment of the arm, supplying the triceps muscles, and the posterior compartment of the forearm, and it is the nerve of extension, and it supplies extensors. One of the major nerves coming out of the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve is going to supply skin and muscles of the anterior compartment of the thigh, like the quadriceps, the sartorius, and so on. The sciatic nerve, which takes origin from the terminal branches of the lumbar, L4, L5, and the upper parts of the sacral, S1, S2, S3. It is going to supply the muscles of the back of the thigh. This group of muscles is called hamstring muscles, and it is going to supply muscles below the knee. So it is a major nerve supply of the lower limb, and it is the largest nerve in the body. This is the story of blood supply to the spinal cord. Spinal cord is made of nervous tissue, and nervous tissue cannot tolerate anoxia, cannot tolerate lack of blood supply and oxygen, and therefore you have several arteries going along the depressions on the external surface of the spinal cord, and there is no problem in nerve supply of the spinal cord. You can hear that there's an infarction in the brain because each area of the brain has a specific artery that supplies it. If this is blocked, then the area will die. In case of spinal cord, you do not hear of infarction of the spinal cord. Surely it is time to write notes, and in this slide and the next slide you see parts of the mind maps of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. It is important that at least you sit down and write some notes, or at least you copy the mind map.